On today's program, I'd like to show you how you can take some of the Hawaiian fabrics and have a lot of fun with them. One of the most important fabric laws we have in quilting is that you can't leave a state without buying fabric. So you can always use that excuse if you overdo. And those of you that have to cross the border between states or countries often, you have a big responsibility, don't you? All right, let's take a look at the quilt behind me. This is made from some fabric that I bought the first time that I traveled to Honolulu to teach. And I found one of the Hawaiian prints that they're so famous for, and that sort of created that quilt for me. Now, let's take a look at the fabric I have in front of me. This was my second trip to Honolulu. I had to follow the laws. And so we're going to create what is a hexagon log cabin using this fabric. After you find your large print to work with this quilt, you need to decide on your other colors. And basically, I take them from the print. And if you look here, the red is the most predominant color here. So I want to repeat a little bit of the red in the piece that I have, but not a lot, because I don't want to take away from the center flower. I have some background colors, of course the black, and I'll use that, and the teal colors, and then gray. So let's take a look at the finished block that we're going to work on today. Here I have my center with the red, and I wanted to right away go to a light color, which is my light gray, so that I give a stark contrast to the black background here. And then I wanted two fabrics from the teal. Remember, that's a color that's sort of in the background here. It's not as predominant as the red, so I wanted to bring two of them in. But this fabric I found has a little bit of the reds in it, which made it just right to lead in to this red and then to the black. So that's how I chose the colors for this particular quilt. And if you're having trouble choosing fabrics for your quilts, it will get easier and it will get more fun. Just stick with it. All right, let's take a look first at how we're going to fussy cut our hexagon. Just move these fabrics over here. I have several different roses in here. I can choose whichever one I want, but you do have to cut them all singly. Let's just open this up. Can't do any double cutting like we do with strips and things like that. Let's get this. Here we go. All right, here we have a rose. We'll take this one, and I'm going to open the hexagon shape and visually center the rose that I have right inside here. And that's the actual size I want, which is 6 inches. But I can't use a rotary cutter on an inside angle because I won't cut all the way into the angle. So what I've done is just taken the next smaller piece, put it in here, remove it. Now it's the exact size I want, and I have outside corners. So I'm going to go ahead and rotary cut this. And one more side. And we should have our hexagon all ready. Now we're ready to add the strips, and I already have my strips cut. They're 1.5 inches. And let's bring this piece out so we can see where the strips go. Here we have our center hexagon. The first strips we're going to add are the light gray, so let's do that right now. And we'll chain stitch. That means we'll go from one to the other. I've already have a security scrap here, and I always like to start, especially when I'm sewing angles, on a security scrap, and then pick up the gray strip, and let's start with this end. And I've overlapped it, not very much at all, and you'll see why we can do that in just a minute when we cut it. We want to sew with 1/4 of an inch, Keep the edges straight. Now you'll always want to sew with the strip on top, because when you have a hexagon or any shape with the angles, only 2 of the edges on this hexagon are on the straight of grain, which means no stretching. You go, see, here's a straight of grain. You go here and look at the stretch. And if you were to sew with that on top, that stretching would take place when you're sewing. But with the strip on top, we don't get any stretching. Okay, we'll sew to the end of where the hexagon is, pick up our next one, and we can overlap them really pretty closely. Probably the first one you make, you'll leave too much room and then you'll waste some extra fabric, but you'll learn how close you can go. So we just sew from one to the next. And of course, if you were making 10, then all 10 would have the strip sewn to one side. And I'm just going to put my security scrap under there, take a few stitches, then I'll be ready for when I come to sew again. Now let's go and press. And at this point, you can either cut your strips and then press them individually. Let me just show you where the gray is. Let's do that, because if you were doing 10 or 12, you'd have a long strip of these. If you just pull these out of the way, you have a big area here, and if you stick in the middle, you'll be okay. Now let's go and press these. We want to first set our stitches. We press exactly the way we sew. That's what that means. Then let the iron do the work. The iron's inside, and it's just one pass straight across. And we have our piece pressed. Same thing here. Set your stitches. Let the iron do the work. And the seam allowance this way will be toward the strip, which is what you want. Let's take a look at how it looks on the back. Right here, that seam allowance is toward the strip. Okay, now we're ready to cut on the angle. And I'm going to use the Star Maker 6 and place it, line it up so it lines up with the outside of the hexagon. And then as extra security, to make sure every piece I make is exactly the same, I'm going to mark where the seam line is. Let's get it straight on there. Now occasionally there'll be lines already on the ruler that you can use. Like for instance on this seam line I do have a line. So I could have used that if you remember. That's my problem anymore. I really like to mark it so I can remember. Okay, and here we have the piece. We'll cut one more here. Again, lining up the outside of the Star Maker with the outside of the hexagon fabric and the mark that I have on the seam line. Now the next step would be to skip a side. And we would go over here and sew a strip, again chain stitching it the same way we did, press it and cut that angle. And when we do that, for every hexagon we have, this is the way it looks. All right, now for this particular hexagon, we would then go and put gray strips right here. So let me go ahead and do that on one side. Again, you would chain stitch. I have my machine all ready with my security scrap. I'm going to take my strip, line it up here, and sew from the security scrap onto the strip, and just sew until you run out of your hexagon piece. You pick up another one, put it here, and do some chain sewing, which is a lot faster. Okay, we'll remove our security scrap and put it here. And you can see by using the security scrap to start, you don't have any long tails to have to cut. All right, let's go and press this piece. Again, the same way, we want to set our stitches. That means pressing exactly the way it was sewn. You would be surprised at how much easier it is to keep an accurate seam allowance during your pressing when you do that step first, because it sets the center of the stitches in the center of the stitching line. That's a trick I learned making clothes a long time ago. Okay, you press that. Now it's time to cut again. Now we need to cut this strip, and I'm going to line up the outside of the Star Maker 6 with the outside of the hexagon. Now you'll notice the hexagon is grown, but we're still lining it up with the outside. Now the static sticker doesn't do us any good now. We need to move that to a seam line so that every time we cut this strip and the other two sides, that's going to be on the seam line. So let's go ahead and cut this. And we're well on our way to have our hexagon log cabin. Now, one of the things that comes up when I teach this class in a workshop is that people will go and do all three sides. And then let me show you what the tendency is. They'll come and they'll mark one angle like this and think they can get away with cutting not only this one, but straight across like this. And it would seem to make sense that you could do that. But you know, sometimes there's just enough of a difference because you don't get to check the angle and you don't get to check where the seam line is. So I would recommend against that. Instead, I would do each angle separately. Because this way, if something doesn't work or line up, you know that you have to make a correction. And you can do it now before you go on to the next step. Okay, after we have the grays, then our next strip would be this shade of a teal green. And you always want to remember to go on the short side. Right here we have a short piece and then seams. So this piece would go on this side, and this side. And again, you would line up the Star Maker 6 and the static sticker with the seam line, so there's no way that you can get off. And this is what our piece looks like. Now, just for a little bit of variety, if you'll take a look at the quilt on the back wall, the center hexagons are done exactly this way. And let me show you using this fabric. But if you look at the rows on the outside, I've reversed the colors. In fact, the centers don't even look like hexagons, because on three sides I started with the darkest fabric, which was a black, and it's the same color as the background. So I'm going to do the same thing with this piece. So let's take a look at how it would look with this fabric. As you can see, I've started just three sides with the gray. So that would bring me to this point right here. And then I take my darkest fabric, which is my black, and I would add that to three sides. So I've just reversed the order the color is in for some of these hexagons. All right, and you can see here, these are the same colors used in this hexagon. Here are the same colors from the light down here to the dark. And that gives it a completely different look. Now that we have all of our hexagons pieced, it's time to sew them together. And talking to quilters around the country as I travel, that's the part that keeps a lot of people from doing hexagons, is sewing them together. Well, maybe the tips I'm giving you, or I'm going to give you, will make it a little bit easier for you. First of all, we're going to look at the center column down the center of the quilt, and that's how I'm going to start sewing them together. And remember, we talked about short sides and long sides. Even though the colors are the same, I like to put a short side to a short side. All right, it just, visually, I just like it better. Our seams will come here. So we'll put these pieces right sides together. And if this is one of those times where you really don't have to pin. So we'll line those up, and now it's time to sew. I'm just going to line up the edges here. I have my security scrap on the machine, so I'll just start sewing onto the hexagon, and the seams just line up, just you know, right at the edge there. There's no tricks to this matching. Just hold them there with your fingers. Now when I get here, I'm going to stitch or hold these pieces together. I call it finger pinning. That's where they're supposed to go. So I'll stitch till I get there. And my fingers should hold them in place. But take your fingers away before you sew. We don't want you to sew over your fingers. And then sew all the way to the end. I call this anchoring the seam. That means we sew all the way to the end. Most people, when they sew hexagons together, they think they need to stop 1/4 of an inch from the end. Well, I'm here to tell you it works much better if you sew all the way to the end. Let's get our security scrap here. We'll sew onto that. And then no tails here on our thread. And now we're ready to press this. And I'm going to just press to one side. It really doesn't matter which side. And from the right side, well, let's set our stitches. We do want to do that, pressing exactly as we sew it. Then I just roll my piece. I lift one piece up, put the iron on, and then press from the right side, and just one press. We don't want to overpress. Okay, now let's assume that you have your whole row done, and what we need to do now is to set in this piece. Now it's a good idea to lay out all your pieces, because as you can see, we have a light color here and a dark. That's going to happen. You can't avoid that. But what you can do is change whichever one is to the top of the quilt. So here I have a light at the top, the dark at the bottom. So play around with it. It might depend on how your rose is cut. And it really doesn't matter as far as piecing it, but visually it would make a difference. Now we want to be sure and sew with this piece on top. If you remember that, then you can sort of play around with this piece to see which one you should start with. Because if we line these up this way, you'd be sewing here. That's not what you want. So that means we're going to sew this piece first. So I'll line this up. And the reason I do that is so that I can flip it over and see exactly this seam. And I've done it in white thread so you can really see it. That's the seam that controls this. So I'm going to line up my hexagons and be really careful. Every edge of this top hexagon has to line up with every edge of the one underneath. You're not going to see the one underneath when you sew. So it's time for a pin. I've got them what I think is lined up perfectly. So I'm going to put a pin right here into the seam and out the seam. And then turn it over and look, and there should be 1/4 of an inch. Now I think I'm a little bit off here. Can measure if you have to, but I think most of you can really get 1/4 of an inch nailed down. There, that's closer to the 1/4 of an inch. So that's when I sew, that's exactly where I'm going to stop sewing, but I'm going to leave the needle down in the fabric. So let's go and do that. We want to sew right from the edge to anchor that seam. Now there are some of you out there that are still skeptics about whether this will work. I'll just have to prove it to you. We can get rid of this right now. And I want to keep my edges together, and with your fingers hold that pin where it's pinned together. Put a little bit of pressure on the fabric. Okay, and again, I'm not going to sew over the pin, but I have the pin there, and about 1 stitch before the pin, I'm going to take it out. Take 1 more stitch, and then I want to leave the needle down in the fabric, lift the presser foot, and now I'm going to reach under and fold this piece. It'll fold the way it should naturally, because now I want to bring this underneath hexagon around. Just make sure there's no folds and creases underneath. We're lining up this next edge of this hexagon that we haven't sewn yet and the one underneath. Feel with your fingers. If there's more fabric than should be there, you'll be able to tell. Okay, when you've got it situated, just start stitching. Hold these edges together, and we're going to sew all the way to the edge. And that wasn't so bad for sewing hexagons together. And let me just put my security scrap under there so I'm ready for next time. And let's go and press this and take a look at how well we did. Here we have our inside point that gives everybody so much trouble. And let me talk a little bit about why this technique works. I know a lot of you know that you need to pivot here, and that's what I did. But most directions for pivoting tell you to leave all the seam allowances open going in there. And you know, if you're going to pivot, only one piece needs to be loose, not everything. That's a little bit too hard. Okay, now I'm going to press my seams. And again, I'll press from the right side. And we have a perfect inside corner. And this will work whether your hexagon is just one piece of fabric like the center, or whether I've pieced it out. All right, now let me just lay this down the way it would be in my quilt. Here's my center row. Here's this piece, and we'll have a row of those hexagons on the outside. Now what we need to do is to figure out how we're going to get a piece in here that will work with the quilt. All right, so what we're going to do is to take one of these hexagons. They should all be the same size, so you only need to measure one. And if you followed all of the measurements that I've done, this is exactly 16 inches high. So I want to cut a piece of fabric that is exactly half, and I'll just lay it on here so you can see, half of the hexagon plus 1/4 inch. All right, so if this was 16, this is 8 1/4. But measure your own, just add that 1/4 inch. Then what I'm going to do is open this up. I'm going to take the Star Maker 6 again and cut this angle. I have the long edge here along the length of the strip, the bottom of the strip, and cut it. And now taking a piece of static sticker, I'm going to mark my ruler here, and I'm going to put the point right here at the top, right at the top of the strip, and mark wherever the bottom of the strip comes. And then I'm going to move that to the top. And what I want to do is cut this piece now. But you can see I don't have much room here. So what I'm going to do is move a few things out of the way. Leave that there. Put a ruler butted right up against it, making sure that my angles are on and my mark, and then cut it. And I need 2 of these. Let's just go back to here. Let's see, we had it this way, didn't we? This piece will fit right in here. Now, the side pieces are cut from a piece or a strip of fabric that is as wide as the hexagon or as tall, which was 16 inches. And in order to cut that, what we're going to do is fold it in half And we'll take this one line at the top of the star maker and put that at the top and cut on both sides. Open this up and cut right down the middle, and this is the way this piece will look then. And let's put our piece back together. Here we go. Here's one of our tops and bottoms. Here's one of our side pieces. And you add a border and your quilt is ready. And I think you'll find these techniques really fun to do. So go out, cross that state line, and buy some fabric and get started. And I'll be back with you next week on another show.
For information on today's main demonstration, call 1-800-248-KAYE. That's 1-800-248-5293. Or write to us at Kaye's Quilting Friends, Post Office Box 456, West Branch, Michigan, 48661. Please remember to specify the program number. Kaye's Quilting Friends is brought to you in part by Janome America, Fiskars, Sulky of America, and Otlite Technology. Our thanks for joining us for this edition of Kaye's Quilting Friends. We hope the ideas shared with you in this program will make your quilting more enjoyable. Please join us again on the next Kaye's Quilting Friends.